many of you have noticed that when you start to get into recovery and start to practice new things, that you run into a little opposition sometimes from Christians? You guys didn't notice that, right? And they might tell you some things that are pretty widely accepted things. And they sound pretty spiritual. We've talked about a few of those this morning. But we've identified, how many? 8? 8 myths that we tend to hear a lot. And they sound very, 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 very spiritual. And they might be very, very Christian in that they show up in Christian circles a lot. But they're not biblical. And we're going to go through some of those now and examine them. The first one is this. If I set boundaries, I'm being selfish. If I set boundaries, I am being selfish. Has anybody ever heard that one? How many of you say that to others? Okay. There is nothing further from the truth because of this. You know, throughout the day, we've talked about what boundaries do is they define freedom. They define me, and they lend themselves to the fruit of self-control. So, in this sense, they're right. A lot of times when you set boundaries around yourself, you are defining yourself, and in that way, yes, it is a selfish act. But that's not a bad word. See, that's not a bad word. What is the bad word, what is really the S word, is self-centered. And there's a big difference. You know, the Scripture says, don't merely look out for your own needs, but also the needs for others, of others. And the Bible talks about being in relationship, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we're not big promoters of you ought to love yourself. We don't believe that you have to love yourself first before you love others. The Scriptures do not teach that. The Scriptures do teach, however, that we have to be in relationship and we have to be in love relationship with God and others in order to even have a self. And one of the ways we do that is we're very aware, obviously, of how we want to be treated. Treat others as you would want to be treated. That necessitates a self. And so the Bible over and over and over talks about guarding yourself, protecting yourself, developing yourself, getting in touch with yourself. Doesn't sound too Christian, right? You talk about get in touch with your feelings. Get in touch with your talents. Take every thought, obedient or captive to the obedience of Christ. That is a lot of putting arms around the circle that we define as ourselves. And taking stewardship and responsibility for that. Now, usually, where this comes from, is a message that's somewhere in our head that was a manipulative message by somebody when you would exercise God-given initiative, God-given purposing, choosing, and it maybe took you away from somebody else who wanted to possess you. Like Sandy's mother. You know, she would say, here Sandy was 30 years old and it was time to go, off on her own to leave home. God's design, right? And she would say, well, don't you think that's a little selfish to leave the family like that? Have you heard that kind of thing? Yeah, it is. It's selfish. It's not self-centered. It's not sinful. It's not wrong. It's part of God's design. But a lot of people think that the Bible teaches that you're not supposed to have a self and that you're not supposed to be accountable and developing and taking stewardship over that self. There's a lot of passages that talk about that. So when you hear that that's being selfish, you may want to retranslate that into, no, that is being a steward. Myth number 2. Boundaries are a sign of disobedience. Have you ever heard that one? You say no to someone, to something, they ask you to do something. Maybe it's a spiritual activity. Somebody wants something out of you. Or maybe you're going through one of those times of faith where you are not looking like you used to look. Maybe some of the wineskins of your spiritual life are changing. Maybe you are attending a different church. Maybe you're in a season where you are in a desert experience and you're in pain. In other words, you're on a road with God where you're working out your salvation, and that doesn't look like it ought to look to somebody else because you're taking responsibility for yourself, but it may not look like they want you to look. You may be in pain. You may be in a period of upheaval. You may be in a period of like the prodigal or whatever. But you're working it out with God, and you're in a community of others that understand you and they're supporting you, and you're doing all of that, but it doesn't look like somebody else wants it to look. Somebody might come along and say, you know, I see you saying no to things in the church now. Sounds like you're not obeying God. Well, we got to ask a question at that point. Who is God? And usually, the people who say things like this, that you are being disobedient for being in control of your life, are trying to play God, and what it means is you're disobeying them. And they don't like that. Right? And so, remember the teaching, the whole line of teaching in Scripture, where it says that God is in heaven and that He is our Lord, and that sometimes we will say no to what people want because we say yes to Him. And woe to him, who everybody is pleased with all the time. Woe to you when men always speak well of you. In other words, if we're not disobeying somebody, we're not obeying Him. And so there will be many times in your life when God is leading you to do something or you're working on something, and it's going to upset somebody, and maybe even somebody who's spiritually important in your life. Maybe somebody who's had kind of a spiritual parental role in your life. And you might have to say no, and yes, you are disobeying them, but they're not your God. And Jesus says that my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. And sometimes that takes us away from what others want, but it's not disobedience. If you set limits, you're going to lose love. Now that is a strong, strong myth, and it's a strong, strong resistance because God has made each one of us to need relationship. We can't live in a vacuum. We are relational. The vine needs the branch. Woe to the person that falls if there's not another to lift him up. It is not good that man be alone. We need each other. He built that in there. That is a good thing. God looks at that and says, that's good. And so when a person says, we are on a trial, and if you start setting limits and disagreeing, I will leave you, for many of us, it taps into one of the deepest abandonment fears that we can experience. The Scriptures have a lot to say about that. Number one, we can't deny our need for love. We need that. We need attachment. We need connection. So is it a possibility that if you start setting limits at 4:45 today or whenever you leave, and you call somebody up on the car phone that needs your sanctification, is there a chance that someone's going to distance from you? Is that a real possibility? Absolutely yes. It is a real possibility. That's why this myth is sort of half myth, because there are some people that would leave or pull away or get upset. Henry mentioned Jesus' words in Luke 6:26, though, where he said, beware if all men speak well of you. He was referring to the false prophets of the Old Testament that day. He said, for so they treated the false prophets in their day. In other words, if you tickle people's ears, you'll keep them around you. But there's a problem there. If you're used to not having boundaries with other people, you're not present anyway. Let's look at it this way. Yes, setting boundaries will cause disruption in lots of relationships. The question is, were you connected in the first place? See, that's the whole thing. The person that's fused and sort of going along and compliant and being what the Galatians calls a man-pleaser instead of a God-pleaser, do they really have connection in the first place? No, because they're not present. If you're not present with your no in a relationship, you're not there. There's no relationship.
And so you may have been going all your life not realizing you weren't connected, and then finally someone, you set limits and someone leaves. It's sort of like it's the reality of what existed in the first place. You were never there. Second thing about that is people with boundaries have more love than anybody in the world. People with limits, active, exposed, initiative-taking limits, get more connection than anybody in the world. That sounds crazy. You mean people that have these walls like this, they are the people that get connection? Why would that be true? Why would that be true? Sorry?
Because they attract healthy people.
A couple of reasons. One is they start attracting healthier people. They stop drawing boundary busters around them. The second reason is they stay emotionally present with the relationships they do have. They can be loved because they're there. They don't let abuse happen. They don't let exploitation happen. They call manipulativeness when they see it. They say, this isn't going to happen with me. And what happens is the users sort of just drop off and find someone else to exploit. Thirdly, if you're young in all this, how many of you have a PhD in boundaries, right? This is new for a lot of you guys. And what's going to happen is it's going to cause some waves, especially if you've never done it right. You're going to rock the boat. Don't worry about that. Scriptures say that we need to practice to discern good from evil in Hebrews 5:14. So you're going to have conflict. People are going to distance, but the right people are going to come back. Next myth. If I set boundaries, I will hurt others. This is the aggressive fear. Instead of being abandoned, I'm going to be the abandoner. I'll be the aggressive person. Let me ask you a question. Does a pavement hurt a drunk? How'd you mess up your fart? Well, this pavement here is pretty insensitive to my needs. What happened? Well, I had, 8 or 9 or whatever I'm drinking, and then I tripped, and it's the pavement's fault. See, lots of us have a fear that boundaries are an offensive weapon. And what happens is we get afraid that we're going to hurt someone, injure someone with this B word. Well, lots of that has its basis in a misunderstanding of love. If you have been hurt by someone's cruelty, or by an insensitive person, or by someone that wasn't loving to you, you may be carrying a fragile self inside. It's called a fragile sense of self. And lots of times when that hasn't been treated, you will project that onto the world. And then you become a caretaker, rescuer, enabler, codependent, whatever word you want to use. In other words, that my inner fragility gets projected onto everyone else, and I see everybody else as a victim. How can you set limits on a victim? See, and there's fear becomes that everybody else will fall apart if I set limits. When generally it's not their fragility that's the issue, it's ours. So begin looking at your own injuries, your own hurts. When you can start to deal with your own fragility, you'll be less afraid of that. Secondly, boundaries are defensive in nature, not offensive. If you've got people in your life that are beating their head against you and saying, look, you're injuring me because you won't stay up all night and talk, or because you won't give me this or you won't give me that, what's injuring them? Is your boundary injuring them? Their resistance, their character structure, their resistance to the light, their inability to learn is causing large hematomas on their forehead, not you. Okay? So if they're being hurt, it's their character resistance. Number 3, grace and license are not the same thing. Don't give someone grace who wants more boundarylessness in you. That's not grace. Another chance is not always grace. Romans 5 and 6 talks about this. It says, okay, grace abounds, so we're supposed to sin the more? What does Paul say in Romans 6:1? God forbid, may it never be, me genoita. How can we have died to sin still live in it? And lots of us get confused about, well, maybe if I give them another chance, or another dole, or another bailout, or let them abuse me some more, they'll feel the love. I promise you, people who are resistant to the light need love, but it needs to be in the form of an anvil. There's more than one kind of love. Permission is not the thing. That's why 1 Thessalonians 5 says we're to admonish the unruly. So you don't give them grace because they experience license. You give them limits and you love them. and they take in the structure and they internalize it. Will they yell? Yes. Will they scream? Yes. Will they call you bad? Yes. You need your support group, don't you? But over time, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. It's not injury, it's pain.
Okay, the next one. Boundaries mean I'm angry. That can come from a few places. One is, a lot of times maybe that was true. Like you got so pushed up in the corner that you didn't have any tool except to explode. And so you've kind of learned, I only say no when I'm really ready to murder somebody. And so I've associated boundaries with being very, very angry. But see, boundaries are proactive, not reactive. And boundaries are when we are in control of ourselves. And in fact, the most well-boundaried people don't experience a lot of anger because they're like a city with walls. See, they don't get pushed, and they don't get shoved, and they don't get cornered. And so there's really not a lot to be angry about. And when we don't have good boundaries, we have a lot to be angry about, all the time. Now, another place this comes from is this, that oftentimes people will only say no or only do something as a way of communicating anger. In other words, if you're passive-aggressive, that you might have gotten into a pattern or know someone who treated you this way that withholds love, withholds giving as a way of saying no. And so you've learned that whenever somebody says no, there's something wrong in the relationship. You ever had the feeling you ask someone to do something or to spend time with you or whatever, and they go no, and instantly you feel what? Wonder, what did I do wrong? Are they mad at me? And we have a basic sort of orientation that tends to divide love and limits. And we think that when we run up against a limit, that love is gone. And if they loved me, or if I love you, then like John said, I would do this, or they would do this. See, love is continuous. My unconditional connection to someone needs to be unbroken. No matter what happens in the relationship, I love. Can't help but love. Right? But what I will do for you is a dotted line. I'll do this, no, I won't do this. Yes, no, yes, no. But in the no's, in the gaps, remember the love is constant. That's love and limits. God does that with us. His love is constant. Does He say yes to everything we want? No. And see, oftentimes it's even the exact opposite. That by our no, we are loving when we are setting limits. When we're having boundaries, that may be the form of discipline in someone else's life. And it means anything but anger. In fact, Proverbs teaches that with children, what? He who does not discipline his son hates him. The one without limits is the one that hates. And we see that over and over and over in codependent relationships, that there's not really a lot of love there. And so don't confuse setting limits with being unloving or being angry. It's exactly the opposite. And passive people who don't have good boundaries are the most angry people in the world. And they act it out in a lot of ways. They act it out on their body. They act it out passively in relationships. Sabotage, self-sabotage, bitterness, all of that. And people who, if you count their no's, if you count their boundaries and their boundary-setting behaviors, and they have a lot of them, and they're good in that, and they have a lot of self-control, they just don't get angry very much. They just kind of say, no, I don't want to do that. And then you find that they say yes, and when they say yes, they mean it, and they follow through. So boundaries don't mean that I'm angry. I get angry when I don't have boundaries. And that's very, very, very different than a lot of times what we feel or what we believe. Okay, the next one. When others set boundaries with me, it injures me. Many times, people's choices take them away from us. That's the way relationship is supposed to be. Relationship has togetherness and separateness. If you read Proverbs 31, for example, where it's describing the wife, it describes two separate lives within one life of the marriage. She's out doing this, he's at the gates doing this. They have boundaries that take them apart at times. And that creates longing that brings people back together. And a lot of times, boundary sorts of choices will separate us. And that's the way God designed it. The Trinity is separate from one another. The Father's on the throne, Jesus is walking on the water, and the Spirit is all over the place causing things to happen. See, they have separateness. But if we have a lot of abandonment feelings, if we have tried to make person into a symbiotic parent that I've got to be fused with all the time, when they do normal sorts of things like separate from me or say no to me, I experience that as injury. And that's because in my own emotional brain, I probably had not enough love before I got boundaries. See, God has designed it where we get bonded first, and then we start to experience boundaries so separateness doesn't leave us empty. But if we have a lack of attachment deep within our soul, we will experience boundaries as injurious. And whenever we experience that, we've got to stop the blaming and realize, no, they are doing this for them, and I am experiencing it in a kooky way. What does that mean about me? What is the emptiness or the brokenness or the abandonment inside of me that I haven't worked through yet, and make it my problem and don't act it out in the relationship? And especially in marriage, where there is always the negotiation of the closeness and the separateness, because by design, that's what it is. If separateness and freedom and limits and autonomy and all of that, which has to be there to build the unity, if that is experienced as abandonment, if that is experienced as injury, and that's acted out and blamed and a lot of anger and all of that, instead of the injured party taking responsibility for those feelings, then it will destroy the relationship. Someone will become controlling, someone will become possessive, someone will try to take away the freedom of another that has to be there in order for there to be love. And so whenever we experience someone's boundaries as injurious, remember what it is, no, how can what someone else does for them injure me? It doesn't. What it does is it gets me in touch with some injuries that I'm bringing to the table to begin with. And I need to take responsibility for those and begin to work them out.
Number 7, but they've done so much for me. See, it's one thing to think about the selfish person in your life, but the hard part is the giver in your life. Or the giver that you've moved out of home with but still need to call every now and then. You know how you can tell when a person's selfish? When they call themselves a giver. I didn't mean to convict anybody, I'm sorry. Because there's an identity there that since I'm a martyr and that's my role, I'm not supposed to get anything back, I'm owed all this stuff. That's the problem with the guilt trap. Lots of us have a relationship in our lives that something good came toward us. Someone extended themselves, someone sacrificed at some level. And the problem is that has become a credit-debit balance that we weren't aware of, that they intended paying us back. I remember I had a client who told me one time, he said, I asked my mother one time why she had kids, because she had a lot of them. And she said, because I was lonely. Now think about, some of you have had this experience, think about being born out of the womb of someone who says, hi, glad you're here, I'm lonely, take care of me. That's your job. There's an immediate set of checks and balances and a debit-credit ledger set up. And that's the problem. The guilt trap basically is a confusion between love and seduction. Because what it says is, what you're getting is not freely given. There's a price in there. There's a contract we're signing, I just didn't tell you about it. And what happens is there's going to be a payback time. And so the payback will come at some time when you don't have anything to offer, or you thought that everything was fine, and find out you told that person no, and they say, after all I've what? Done for you. Well, to understand that myth is to understand two things. One, love is always a free gift. And you're going to need to start checking out with people that are giving you something. Is there like a checking account attached to this that I need to be aware of? Because I may not want this. That's why people have kids and they think when I'm older then I won't be lonely or whatever, and the kids say, I'm sorry, I didn't know there was a rubber band here. It's 3,000 miles long now. Are you reeling it in now? If love is a gift, the only response that God ever wanted was gratitude. God just wanted us to appreciate what He'd done for us when He died on the cross. Why? Because He knew that gratitude would cause obedience. He didn't die and then say, now, I'm going to be really upset if you don't appreciate this. He just let it happen. Love is always free. It's never a contract. The second thing about that is that when you respond to it in guilty compliance, you are not being loving. If the only reason you're making that visit like Henry's client to Arizona or whatever on Thanksgiving is guilty compliance, are you going to be there presently and emotionally? Are you going to really be there? No, you're going to resent it the whole time. So don't call your guilty compliance, well, I guess I'm supposed to call them because they'll be upset and they've done so much for me. Don't call that love. It won't feel like love. If you've been the recipient of that and you know it doesn't feel like love, it's hatred disguised as Christianity. Guilty compliance isn't love, because love always comes out of a full heart. There's no fear in love. It is always a gift out of a full heart. Then the last myth. Boundaries are permanent, and I'm scared of burning my what? Burning my bridges. Burning my bridges. I see this a lot, especially with parents who are really scared that when they set a limit, they need to keep it permanent and never change it. And maturity always demands that you change limits with new information. In other words, when you tell someone, when you yell at me, I'm out the door, or I'm going to go call the cops for, to put a restraining order on you when you come at me, or when you're not responsible, I'm not going to pay for it anymore, I'm going to cut off the credit cards, that is always subject to you. Your boundaries are not owned, they don't own you. You own your boundaries. Take ownership of your boundaries. They belong to you. And they are always open to change if the person repents. See, lots of our boundaries exist because the person hasn't repented yet, and we have to protect ourselves. But the Scriptures have all kinds of examples of God changing boundaries when people repented. Don't be afraid that when you set a limit, it's in concrete. It's not. It's always subject to the person's repenting, the person maturing, your own needs changing. You are in charge of your boundaries, and they're always a semi-permeable membrane. You decide where the gate is, where it's open, where it's closed. This will change as your relationships change. And if you have that fear that as I set limits, I'm burning a bridge, you're probably putting somebody, some critical parent in your head into the relationship where you're afraid that once you set a limit, they would distance forever. Mature people always renegotiate boundaries. Loving people always go that route. There's always resilience in boundaries. And if there's not, what you've got is a child-parent relationship, and that never works.